Judge Prescott never expected Pam Bondi to turn the tables on him. He thought a simple fine would silence her. Instead, she dismantled his argument, piece by piece, in front of the entire courtroom. The Tampa courthouse had seen its share of legal battles, but no one was prepared for what was about to unfold. Pam Bondi strode through the heavy wooden doors, sharp as ever. One hand held her briefcase. The other adjusted the lapel of her blazer. This was supposed to be a routine hearing, one she could argue in her sleep. But as she approached the defendant's table, she felt the weight of Judge Alan Prescott's gaze, and he wasn't looking at her face. His eyes were fixed just below her collarbone on the simple gold cross she wore. A shift in the air. A beat of silence. Then, in a voice as sharp as a gavel strike, Prescott cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Miss Bondi, I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Pam barely blinked. "Your Honor, your cross violates the neutrality of this space," he said. "Remove it or face a fine." A murmur rippled through the spectators. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The clerk cast a nervous glance between the judge and Pam. This wasn't the first time a judge had asserted control over a courtroom in an unusual way, but it was the first time anyone had tried to fine an attorney for wearing a necklace. Pam remained still. "Your Honor, my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside." Judge Prescott's face remained unreadable. "That's not how I see it," he said, sighing. "Either remove it, or I will issue a fine for disregarding courtroom neutrality." For the first time in her career, Pam Bondi was fined, not for misconduct, not for a procedural violation, but for wearing a piece of jewelry. The fine wasn't the issue. It was what it represented. She didn't take off the cross. Instead, she folded her hands over her briefcase, her expression cool and composed. She wasn't about to let this go. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to address this issue formally." Judge Prescott raised a brow. "Address it?" "Yes. I will be filing an objection and would like to state my argument on record." A smirk flickered across the judge's face. He glanced at the clock. "Miss Bondi, I assume you're aware that this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances." Pam didn't flinch. "And I assume you're aware that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions." That got his attention. The judge leaned back, his fingers laced together. The court reporter's hands hovered over the keyboard. The room was silent, not because of the business dispute, but because an attorney had just challenged a judge's authority to his face. Pam knew she was walking a fine line, but backing down wasn't an option. "Your Honor, let's break this down legally." Prescott exhaled, rubbing his temples. Before he could respond, Pam reached into her briefcase. She wasn't just going to argue. She was about to dismantle his entire premise. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, placing it carefully on the table. Every movement was deliberate. Every second of silence tightened the tension in the room. Judge Prescott sighed. "Ms. Bondi, I don't have time for theatrics." Pam's expression didn't waver. "Neither do I, Your Honor. But what I do have is a firm understanding of constitutional law." The judge leaned forward, his fingers tightening. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Ms. Bondi." Pam nodded. "It does, but that authority is not above the Constitution." She tapped the paper. "Under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it does not disrupt proceedings." The judge scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Pam smiled, cold, unwavering. "Then let's talk case law." She lifted the paper. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. A landmark case establishing that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that's a school or a courtroom. The judge's jaw tightened. Just slightly. He had started digging himself into a hole. He just didn't realize how deep it went. He knew that case. Everyone in the legal field did. But Pam Bondi wasn't finished. West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943, she continued, her voice unwavering. The Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights. She set the paper down with deliberate precision. Now, Your Honor, would you like me to keep going, or would you prefer to reconsider that fine? A tense silence filled the room. Judge Prescott's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. He was cornered, and he knew it. But his pride wouldn't let him concede, at least not yet. This is not a religious debate, Miss Bondi. Pam tilted her head. Then why did you make it one? A few quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom. Prescott's face darkened. Enough. His voice was sharp, but the authority behind it was slipping. Pam leaned forward, her tone steady. With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine because so far I haven't heard one. A long pause. The judge finally turned to the clerk. Mark, the fine is pending review. Pam smirked. I'll take that as a temporary victory, but she wasn't done. The real fight was just beginning. Judge Prescott's expression remained unreadable, but his posture betrayed him. He had expected quiet compliance, not a full-blown constitutional challenge. The air in the courtroom was no longer just tense. It was electric. Pam could feel it. Every set of eyes was locked on her, watching, waiting. She had drawn a line in the sand, and now the judge had two choices: stand by his weak justification and risk humiliation, or find a way to backtrack without losing control. But Prescott wasn't one to back down easily. Miss Bondi, he began, his tone measured. Courtroom rules exist for a reason. If I allow one form of personal expression, I open the door to all of them. Pam's lips pressed together. You mean like the wedding bands worn by half the attorneys here? Or the lapel pins you allow? On government officials? Prescott's jaw tightened. Pam didn't let up. Or should we talk about the time you allowed a defense attorney to wear a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial? You had no issue with that. A murmur spread through the observers. Prescott shot a glare toward them, but the damage was done. Pam had just exposed his selective enforcement. She sat back, arms crossed. So tell me, Your Honor, why does this rule apply only to my cross? Prescott's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. He was trapped, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. He had enforced an unwritten rule based on personal bias. And now, it was crumbling beneath him. For the first time since the hearing began, he had no response. Pam didn't need to gloat. She let the silence stretch, long enough for everyone to absorb the reality of the situation. Then, she delivered the final blow. If you stand by this fine, Your Honor, I will be filing an appeal before the ink dries on the ruling, and when that happens, I guarantee this case will make headlines. She let it sink in, a sitting judge fining a woman for wearing a cross in court. The higher courts would love to weigh in on that precedent. Prescott's nostrils flared. His ego and his pride waged a silent war against cold, hard reality. Pam didn't look away. She let him sit with it. The longer he delayed, the more obvious his mistake became. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply. Fine is rescinded, he muttered. Pam smiled. Much appreciated, Your Honor. But this wasn't just about a fine anymore. She had sent a message. One Prescott wouldn't forget anytime soon. And the fallout? That was only just beginning. Debunked. Judge's words, the fine is rescinded, should have ended it. But the courtroom was no longer just a legal battleground. It had become a spectacle. Everyone had just witnessed something they wouldn't soon forget. The court reporter barely looked up from her keyboard, but even she knew this transcript would circulate far beyond this room. The clerk, who had looked uneasy when the fine was first announced, stole a quick glance at Pam, almost as if impressed. Judge Prescott straightened his papers, as if trying to physically erase the moment, but Pam knew better. This wasn't something he could brush aside. The silence was deafening. Pam calmly adjusted her blazer, the small gold cross still in place, exactly where it had been the entire time. She had won. But now she needed to make sure this wasn't just a personal victory. It had to mean something more. She turned to her client, a middle-aged business owner, the real reason she was here. And the real fight was still ahead. The man gave her a nod, barely concealed but unmistakable. Respect. His confidence in her was only growing stronger. Pam knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. A reporter, one who had been covering an entirely different case in the same building, caught wind of what had just unfolded. Within an hour, a local news site ran the headline: Florida judge attempts to fine attorney for wearing a cross, but it doesn't go as planned. Pam's phone buzzed, then again, and again. Colleagues, former law school classmates, journalists, everyone wanted to know what had just happened. But Pam wasn't interested in headlines or media spins. She had a bigger picture in mind, her next step, taking this fight beyond a single courtroom skirmish. She wasn't naive. Cases like these had ripple effects, whether she intended them to or not. This wasn't just about one judge or one attorney. Anymore, this was about precedent, one that hadn't been set yet but very well could be. Would other judges attempt something similar? Would attorneys feel pressured to leave their personal symbols at home to avoid confrontation? Would this moment embolden others to push the boundaries of courtroom neutrality in ways that targeted personal beliefs? Pam wasn't going to let that happen. By evening, the story had already taken on a life of its own. A well-known legal commentator on a conservative news network brought it up during a panel discussion. On social media, heated debates erupted, some siding with the judge, others hailing Pam's defiance as an important stand for constitutional rights. Pam sat in her office, watching the discussion unfold on her phone. A producer from a national news network had already reached out, requesting an interview. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. She had spent years fighting for clients, standing her ground in high-stakes cases. But this felt different. This wasn't about corporate disputes or criminal defense. This was about personal freedom, and whether it could be stripped away on the whim of a single judge. But Judge Prescott wasn't done with her yet. Pam could feel it. Even as she left the courthouse that day, the way he had looked at her before banging the gavel and dismissing the session, he might have rescinded the fine. But in his expression, there had been something else. An unspoken challenge. She didn't know what form it would take, but she knew this battle was far from over. Pam expected some fallout. A few emails, maybe a couple of phone calls from colleagues weighing in. What she hadn't expected was the speed at which everything escalated. By the time she walked into her office the next morning, her assistant, Lauren, was already waiting. Concern etched across her face. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Pam took it, scanning the screen. The Florida Bar Association had just issued a statement, carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the roles set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Pam let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment. This was a warning. The phrase, "respect the roles set forth by presiding judges," wasn't just a general statement. It was a signal. The legal world was tight-knit. The Florida Bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was getting out of hand. This meant Prescott wasn't just bitter. He was already working behind the scenes. Pam set the tablet down. "This came out today?" Lauren nodded. "An hour ago." Pam wasn't surprised. The legal community was small. Word traveled fast, and Prescott wasn't taking this lightly. But before she could say another word, Lauren hesitated. "There's more." Pam glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Go on." Lauren handed her another document, this one printed. Pam skimmed the first few lines, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Pam let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming." She shook her head. "That's rich," Lauren sighed. It's retaliation. Pure and simple. Pam leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. Prescott wasn't just looking for payback. He was trying to set an example. He had lost in his own courtroom. And now, he was using the system to reassert his power. By filing this formal complaint, he wasn't just coming after her. He was trying to flip the narrative. He was no longer the judge who had overstepped his authority. Now he was painting himself as the victim, the one who had been disrespected. And Pam? He wanted to make her look like the reckless attorney who had challenged him just for the sake of challenging him. Pam had seen this move before. It was a classic tactic. Turn the accuser into the accused, reframe the story, bury the real issue beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. But she wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" she asked, already shifting gears. Lauren exhaled. "You have 10 days to respond. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Pam nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" Lauren hesitated. "A panel, judges, and senior attorneys." Pam almost smiled. If Prescott thought he could drown her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated, because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was about to become very public. Lauren studied her, waiting for her reaction. "What do you want to do?" Pam took a deep breath, then reached for her phone. "If Prescott wants to play games, let's play." Her mind was already 10 steps ahead as she scrolled through her contacts. Prescott thought she would defend herself in a closed-door hearing, accept a quiet reprimand and move on. He didn't understand who he was dealing with. Pam had spent her career playing the long game. And now, she was about to make sure everyone was watching. She didn't waste time. She knew exactly how these things worked. Retaliation was most effective in the shadows. Prescott wanted to use the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen. Pam scrolled through her phone, found the name she needed, and pressed call. 2 rings, then a familiar voice. "Pam, I was just about to call you." Lisa Reynolds, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program. She had covered some of Pam's biggest cases before. More importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. Pam got straight to the point. "Lisa, listen carefully. A judge just filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings. But here's what really happened. He tried to fine me for wearing a cross. I stood my ground. He backed down. And now he's using the system to punish me instead." Silence. Then Lisa let out a sharp breath. "You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out his abuse of power?" Pam smiled. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm running this." Pam leaned forward. "I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Prescott won't be able to twist this into a quiet disciplinary issue." Lisa was already ahead of her. "I'll have a segment up by tomorrow, and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in, especially the ones who won't be afraid to call this out for what it is." Pam hung up, feeling the first stirrings of momentum shift in her favor. But she wasn't done yet. She turned back to Lauren. "Draft a public statement. I want my position clear before Prescott and his allies try to muddy the waters." Lauren nodded. "You want to frame this as judicial overreach?" Pam shook her head. "I want to frame it as exactly what it is, an attack on personal rights and an abuse of judicial power. If this judge thinks he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a platform." Lauren's expression hardened. "I'll get it done." Pam exhaled, gathering her thoughts. Prescott had been counting on silence. Now the country was about to find out exactly what he had done. She didn't have to wait long. The next morning, as she sat down with her coffee, her phone was already buzzing nonstop. News outlets had picked up Lisa Reynolds' segment overnight. Social media was ablaze. The headline was everywhere. "Florida judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing a cross, now he's under fire." And it wasn't just conservative outlets running the story. Legal analysts across the board, left, right, and center, were weighing in. A constitutional lawyer from Georgetown went on live television, tearing Prescott's logic apart. This is a blatant overreach with no legal standing. Another high-profile attorney posted a thread dissecting how Pam's actions had exposed a dangerous precedent that needed to be addressed. And then came the statement Pam had been waiting for. The Florida Judicial Review Board announced that, due to the media attention, they would be reviewing Judge Prescott's conduct to determine whether his ruling had violated judicial ethics. Pam leaned back in her chair, exhaling. This was no longer just about her. This wasn't just about her. It was about every attorney who had ever defended a client, every defendant who had ever stood before a judge, every person who had ever stepped into a courtroom, wondering if their rights could be erased with the stroke of a pen. Lauren walked in, holding up her phone. "You're going to want to see this." Pam took it and pressed play. There he was, Prescott. Standing outside the courthouse, cameras flashing around him, his expression stiff. The statement was short, too short for someone trying to defend himself. "I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom. The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully." Pam almost laughed. Neutrality. He was still trying to play that card. Lauren crossed her arms. "He's trying to save face." Pam nodded. And failing, because this wasn't going away. The Judicial Review Board had a decision to make. If they ruled against Prescott, it wouldn't just be a professional embarrassment, it would set a precedent, one that protected attorneys like Pam from ever facing this kind of retaliation again. But even if they didn't formally reprimand him, he had already lost where it mattered most: his reputation, his credibility, his authority. Because after this, every attorney who stepped into his courtroom would know this was the judge who tried to silence someone and lost. Pam took a slow sip of her coffee, then looked up at Lauren. "We won." Lauren smirked. "Oh, I know." Pam set her cup down. She hadn't just fought for herself. She had sent a message. Never let someone in power strip away your rights without a fight, because sometimes all it takes is one person standing their ground to change everything.